In 1952, a woman named Ruth Ellen Combs fed a family of 6 in McDowell County, West Virginia on $9 a week. She didn't have a grocery list. She had a cast iron skillet, a 10-pound bag of cornmeal, 2 pounds of dried pinto beans, and the kind of knowledge her mother passed down without ever writing a word. Number 12 on this list fed an entire family for 3 days on less than 30 cents. Number 7 was what her husband took to the coal mine every day for 20 years in a paper bag, and number 1 grew in her front yard every fall and cost absolutely nothing. These 25 meals were not on any restaurant menu. They were not in any cookbook. They were in the hands of women who stood at a stove every night and found something to put on the table even when the pantry was nearly bare. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 forgotten dollar meals that kept the 1950s working class full. Number 25. Water gravy on toast. When there wasn't any milk, butter, or meat in the house, there was still flour, water, and the drippings stuck to the bottom of the skillet from the night before. Your mother scraped those drippings loose with a wooden spoon, sprinkled flour in and stirred until it browned, then poured in water and worked it until a pale, thin gravy formed. She poured it over toast and set the plate in front of you. In the mill towns of the Piedmont and the mining camps of eastern Kentucky, water gravy was the meal that appeared on the last night before payday. It didn't have a name in most households. Families just called it gravy and bread because naming it would have made it real. Would have meant admitting out loud that the cupboard was empty. A tablespoon of bacon grease made it taste richer than it had any right to be. 1 skillet, 5 minutes, a handful of flour, and your family could go to bed with something warm inside them. That was enough. Number 24. Bread and milk. A bowl, a few slices of day-old white bread torn into rough pieces, warm milk poured over the top, and sometimes a pinch of sugar. That was supper. In rural homes across Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Ozarks of Arkansas, this was the meal that showed up when the week hadn't finished, but the money had run out. The bread swelled soft in the warm milk, turning the bowl into something almost custard-like if you gave it 2 minutes to sit. A loaf of bread cost 16 cents in 1952. A half gallon of milk was 43 cents. For a family of 5, that is dinner for under 60 cents. No stove required, no pots to wash. Old-timers across the southern mountains still eat bread and milk before bed, the way their grandmothers did back then, not because they have to, because it tastes like the safest night of their childhood. Number 23. Lard sandwich. 2 slices of white bread, a thick spread of lard, salt. That was all. In Depression-era Iowa and the wheat-farming counties of eastern Kansas, lard sandwiches were packed into lunch pails for men heading to fields that wouldn't pay until harvest. Lard cost 8 cents a pound in 1950. A 10-pound can lasted a family 2 weeks, stretched across biscuits, pie crusts, and skillets in ways your grandmother understood and modern cookbooks have never figured out. Children in rural Oklahoma carried them to school wrapped in wax paper. They didn't call it a lard sandwich. They called it a sandwich. The word in front of it was understood and left unspoken. Some families added a smear of sorghum molasses to cut the fat. Others pressed a thin slice of raw onion into it. It filled you. It kept you working. That was the whole point. Number 22. Cornmeal mush. 4 parts water to 1 part cornmeal and salt. That was breakfast across the Midwest and the mountain South for generations. Your grandmother stirred it over low heat for half an hour, then poured it into a loaf pan to cool and firm overnight. In the morning, she sliced it cold, fried those slices in a cast iron skillet until a golden crust formed on both sides, and set them on the table with a drizzle of sorghum. A bag of cornmeal cost 19 cents in 1953. It fed your family breakfast for 3 days. In Pennsylvania Dutch communities across the Cumberland Valley, fried mush was a tradition that goes back further than anyone living can remember. In the Appalachian hollows of North Carolina, it was simply called mush and served without ceremony. No one called it polenta. No one put a price on it at a restaurant. It was something you made with cornmeal and water when the eggs ran out, and it was free, and it was simple, and it worked. Number 21. Fried potatoes and onions. A cast iron skillet, bacon drippings, 3 or 4 potatoes sliced thin, half an onion, salt, pepper, and thyme. Your mother didn't measure anything. She had made this so many times her hands knew what to do before her mind caught up. The potatoes went in first, the onions second, and the whole pan sat over medium heat until everything browned in layers and the kitchen smelled like something worth sitting down for. A 10-pound bag of potatoes cost 53 cents in 1952. In farm communities across Missouri and Indiana, fried potatoes and onions was not a side dish. It was the meal. A woman from a tobacco farm outside Bowling Green, Kentucky, once said that her family ate fried potatoes for supper 4 nights a week for 15 years and never once complained. You probably remember this. Maybe your family called it something different. The dish didn't need a name. It needed a skillet and 20 minutes. Number 20. Macaroni and tomatoes. A box of elbow macaroni, a can of stewed tomatoes, a pat of butter, and sometimes a pinch of sugar. That is dinner. The tomatoes and the pasta cooked together in one pot, the macaroni absorbing the tomato brine until it went soft and orange and thick. In the rural South, particularly across Alabama and Mississippi, this was a Depression-era staple that never quite left the table. Families in Appalachian coal towns added a splash of milk to make it creamier. Farm wives in Georgia made it with fresh tomatoes in summer and switched to canned in winter without changing a single thing. A box of macaroni was 11 cents in 1953. A can of stewed tomatoes was a dime. Dinner for 6 for under 25 cents. If you grew up eating this, the taste is still in your memory right now. Warm and sharp and just slightly sweet, like summer in a bowl. Number 19. Egg in a hole, a slice of bread, a circle cut from the center, butter in the skillet. The bread went in, then the egg cracked directly into the hole, and the whole thing cooked together until the white set and the edges of the bread turned golden and crisp. It had a dozen names depending on where you lived. Egg in a basket, egg in a frame, toad in a hole. In working-class neighborhoods across Pittsburgh and Cleveland, kids called it a bullseye egg. One egg cost about 8 cents in 1954. One slice of bread was a cent. That is breakfast for 9 cents. For a woman feeding 5 children before school, this wasn't a recipe. It was math. Every scrap got used. The bread circle you cut out got fried in the same butter and eaten right alongside the main piece. Nothing was wasted. Not ever. That was the rule in those houses back then, and it was not a rule anyone wrote down. Number 18. Stewed tomatoes and rice, a can of whole tomatoes, a cup of long-grain white rice, a little salt, and a bay leaf when the house had one. The tomatoes cooked down with the rice until everything absorbed together into something thick and tangy and deeply warm. In rural Louisiana parishes and the coastal counties of Georgia, stewed tomatoes and rice was Friday supper in Catholic households that could not afford fish but could not eat meat on Friday either. A can of whole tomatoes was 11 cents in 1955. A pound of rice was 20 cents. That is a hot meal for under 30 cents. If you grew up eating this, the smell is still in your memory, warm and sharp and simple, like safe ground under your feet. Think about what it took to put this on the table every Friday night, year after year, without complaint and without recognition. There was no recipe card because no recipe was needed. There was no timer because the cook knew by the steam when the rice was done. The women who made stewed tomatoes and rice for their families did not receive credit in any history book. They were not paid for the hours they stood at the stove. They did not receive a thank you most nights. They received empty bowls and children who went to bed full. In the farming communities of the Deep South and the coastal lowlands, this is how entire generations were fed, quietly, cheaply, by women who understood that a 30-cent pot of stewed rice and tomatoes made with care was indistinguishable from love. Number 17. Peanut butter and crackers, not a sandwich. A sleeve of saltines and a jar of peanut butter, and the cracker you spread thick with a butter knife and ate standing over the kitchen sink at 3 in the afternoon, when breakfast was a long way off and supper hadn't started yet. A jar of peanut butter cost 22 cents in 1951. A box of saltines was a dime. In the coal mining communities of southern West Virginia, peanut butter and crackers went into lunch pails alongside thermoses of black coffee every single morning. In farmhouses across Ohio and Michigan, it was what children ate between school and chores. Simple, cheap. It filled you and kept you going for hours on not much money. Decades later, people who ate this as kids still reach for it without thinking. That is not nostalgia. That is the way your body remembers what actually worked. Number 16. Soda cracker pudding, a sleeve of soda crackers layered into a baking dish. Custard poured over the top, made from eggs, milk, sugar, and vanilla. Then the whole thing baked until the crackers swelled into something soft and bread-like and the custard set around them. Families across rural Indiana and Tennessee made this when they couldn't afford vanilla wafers. The crackers cost less. The result was nearly the same. A box of soda crackers was 9 cents in 1952. The eggs and milk were already in the house. This was dessert for practically nothing, and it was made by women who understood that dessert mattered even when money didn't stretch. Especially when it didn't. It told the children things were going to be all right. That simple gesture, that bowl of sweet pudding at the end of a thin week, was not nothing. It was everything. You probably had something like it. You know what it meant. Number 15. Tomato gravy on biscuits. Bacon drippings in the skillet. A spoonful of flour stirred in until it browned. Then a can of crushed tomatoes poured over the roux. Salt, pepper, a pinch of sugar, poured over fresh biscuits still hot from the oven. In the farming communities of eastern Tennessee and the Piedmont counties of North Carolina, tomato gravy was breakfast on the days the salt pork ran out. It was also supper on the days a new supply hadn't arrived yet. A can of tomatoes was 11 cents. A bag of self-rising flour was 20 cents and made biscuits for a full week. A woman named Loretta Hensley raised 7 children on a tenant farm outside Morristown, Tennessee in the early 1950s. She made tomato gravy every Monday morning after the weekend had used up the meat. Her children thought Monday breakfast was the best meal of the week. She let them believe it. That was the kind of quiet generosity those women were capable of. Number 14. Hoover stew, a box of macaroni, a can of tomatoes, 2 or 3 hot dogs sliced into rounds, and a can of corn or peas. Everything thrown into one pot, brought to a boil, and simmered together until the pasta finished cooking and the broth thickened slightly from the tomato juice. Named after President Herbert Hoover, this stew was born in the soup kitchens and hobo camps of the 1930s. By the 1950s, it had moved into working-class kitchens across the industrial Midwest, particularly in the mill towns of Ohio and Pennsylvania, where factory families made it on the weeks the shifts ran short. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't supposed to be. A package of hot dogs cost 35 cents in 1954. A box of macaroni was 11 cents. A can of tomatoes was 11 cents. A can of corn was a dime. That is a pot of hot food for under 70 cents, enough to fill 8 people. Nobody left the table hungry after Hoover's stew. That was enough. Number 13. Salmon patties, a can of pink salmon, the bones mashed soft and mixed right in, an egg, a handful of crushed crackers, salt, pepper, a minced onion when there was one, shaped into patties and fried in bacon grease until both sides turned a deep golden brown and the outside crisp. A can of pink salmon cost 25 cents in 1952. It made 4 to 6 patties. That is dinner for a family of 4 for a quarter. In farm communities across the Mississippi Delta and the tobacco counties of Virginia, salmon patties were Friday night supper made by women who had never seen a coastline in their lives and never needed to. They made them every week, generation after generation, because that is how their mothers did it, and the mothers before that. The bones dissolved in the frying. The flavor stayed. No one called it seafood. They called it supper, and that was the end of the conversation. Number 12. Beans and cornbread. A bag of dried pinto beans cost 29 cents in 1954. A box of cornmeal was 19 cents. Together, they fed a family of 8 for 3 days and delivered something close to complete protein without a single piece of meat on the table. A woman in the hills of Pike County, Kentucky soaked her pintos overnight, then set them to simmer all morning with a ham bone, half an onion, and nothing else. The cornbread, baked in the same cast-iron skillet her mother used before her, greased with bacon drippings until the edges turned black and crispy and the center stayed soft enough to crumble into the bean broth. You ate it by tearing the cornbread into the pot liquor and letting it soak. That is how it was done. That is how it has always been done. Beans and cornbread was the meal that held Appalachia together for 100 years. In the mountain communities of West Virginia, they called it soup beans and made it on Mondays after a weekend that had stretched everything thin. Kentucky families used pintos, Tennessee families used white beans, Midwestern families used navy beans grown in Michigan. The bread changed too. Corn pone in the mountains, hoe cakes on the plains, Johnny cakes in New England. But the logic was always the same. Cheap starch, cheap protein, one pot, one skillet, a full table. Here is what nobody tells you. The foods that actually kept American families alive across generations are the foods no corporation has figured out how to brand. There's no loyalty campaign for a bag of dried beans. There is no advertising budget behind a box of cornmeal. Dried pintos in 2026 cost under $2 a pound and can feed a family for days. The math hasn't changed. The meal hasn't changed. Only the shame attached to it has faded, and even that is long overdue. Number 11. Poor man's meal. Cubed potatoes fried hard in a cast-iron skillet until the edges browned and crisped. An onion sliced in alongside them. Salt and pepper. Then hot dogs sliced into rounds added near the end, just long enough to blister and color. A splash of water to make a thin sauce in the pan. A package of 8 hot dogs cost 32 cents in 1952. Potatoes were 40 cents for 10 pounds. Poor man's meal fed a family of 5 for under $1. In working-class neighborhoods across Detroit, Chicago, and the steel towns of the Pittsburgh corridor, this was the meal that appeared at the end of the week when the paycheck was already spent and there were still 3 days to go. Your mother didn't look up the recipe. She had made it so many times she didn't need to. One skillet, 30 minutes, and the whole house smelled like something worth coming home to. That is dinner for under $1. Number 10. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Dried salted beef shredded into a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, then poured over 2 slices of toast. Your father probably called it SOS. He had eaten it every morning in a mess hall somewhere in Korea or Germany, and the full name wasn't polite enough for the dinner table. But he ate it when your mother made it on Thursday nights because the paycheck came on Friday, and this was a meal that asked almost nothing of the pantry. A jar of chipped beef cost 45 cents in 1955. A quart of milk was 25 cents. Dinner for 6 for under $1. The United States Army had been making this dish since 1910, when it first appeared in the Manual for Army Cooks. By the 1950s, every veteran in America recognized it, and half of them had brought it home without quite realizing it. 10 minutes, 1 skillet, and a warm plate of something real. That was enough. Number 9. Biscuits and sausage gravy. Sausage crumbled and fried until done, then flour sprinkled over the drippings and stirred until the roux browned, then milk poured in and cooked until the gravy thickened around the meat. Poured over split biscuits still hot enough to steam. In the mountain communities of the Ozarks and the hill counties of Arkansas, this was Sunday breakfast for families that couldn't afford much else, but could always make this. A pound of bulk sausage cost 39 cents in 1953. A bag of self-rising flour made 2 weeks of biscuits. A quart of milk was 25 cents. That is a full table for under $1. Sawmill gravy, white gravy, country gravy. It had as many names as there were counties that made it. But the dish itself was always the same. Cheap fat, cheap flour, cheap milk, hot biscuits. The combination tasted like something that cost 3 times what it did. That has always been its power. Number 8. Potato soup, diced potatoes, a quartered onion, water to cover, salt, and when the potatoes turned soft enough to break apart with a spoon, a cup of whole milk stirred in and a pat of butter. That was the recipe. In the German immigrant farm communities of central Iowa and eastern Nebraska, potato soup was Monday supper, using the leftover boiled potatoes from Sunday dinner. Nothing was ever thrown away. Nothing. In the hollows of eastern Tennessee, women added a bit of bacon and called it done. A pound of potatoes cost 5 cents in 1953. That is soup for a family for under 30 cents. Some grandmothers added shredded cheese on top. Others floated a slice of white bread in the bowl and called it bread soup. Every version was warm. Every version asked almost nothing of you. You didn't need to know how to cook to make potato soup. You needed potatoes and time. Both were usually available, even on the worst weeks. Number 7. Fried bologna sandwich. A thick slice of bologna, a slit cut in the center so it laid flat in the skillet instead of doming up. Fried in butter or bacon grease until the edges crisped and a slight char formed and the whole kitchen filled with a smell that stops people cold 50 years later. Placed on soft white bread with yellow mustard, nothing else. Bologna was cheap in the 1950s because it was made from the parts of the animal nobody else was buying. In textile mill towns across the Carolinas and tobacco farms across Virginia, it was what went into the lunch pail every single day for years. A pound of bologna cost 29 cents in 1952. A loaf of white bread was 16 cents. That is lunch for an entire week for under 50 cents. The fried bologna sandwich is called the working man's steak across much of the American South, and that name tells you everything about the class history of this country. It grew out of industrial poverty and immigrant labor. German meatpackers brought bologna to America in the 19th century, and it took root in the South and the Appalachian states because it was the cheapest source of meat protein available. In factory towns across the Carolinas, mobile lunch wagons called bologna wagons made the rounds during the morning break, selling thick-cut fried bologna to textile workers who had 15 minutes and no other options. That was breakfast. That was the working man's steak. Here is the truth about why this sandwich disappeared from family tables. It wasn't because it stopped tasting good. It tastes exactly the same as it always did. It disappeared because the families who ate it worked so hard to move beyond it that they couldn't bring themselves to serve it to their children. Prosperity buried it. Shame buried it deeper. And now it turns up on menus at upscale Southern restaurants for $14, which is either a reclamation or an irony, depending on where your family came from. Number 6. Ham hock and cabbage. A single smoked ham hock in a pot with water, brought to a boil and simmered for an hour until the broth turned smoky and the fat began to melt. Then a whole head of green cabbage cut into quarters and dropped in, cooked down until the cabbage went soft and absorbed the ham flavor all the way through. Salt, pepper. Nothing else needed. In the working-class neighborhoods of Baltimore and the farming counties of southern Ohio, this was the meal that stretched a 3-pound ham hock into dinner for 7 people. Cabbage cost 4 cents a pound in 1953. A smoked hock was under 50 cents. That is a full pot for under 60 cents. The pot liquor left at the bottom, the dark smoky broth the cabbage cooked in, got sopped up with cornbread. Nothing was left. Nothing was ever left in those kitchens. That was the tradition. Number 5. Navy bean soup. A pound of dried white navy beans, a ham bone, an onion, 2 or 3 carrots, water to cover, and an entire afternoon. The beans soaked overnight, went into the pot in the morning, and simmered on the back burner for hours while everything else got done. By supper time, the broth had turned thick and cloudy, and the beans had broken down enough to cream slightly against the spoon. A pound of dried navy beans cost 12 cents in 1951. A ham bone came from Sunday's dinner and cost nothing at all. Navy bean soup has been made in American homes since the colonial era. By 1903, it was the official soup of the United States Senate, served every single day because a senator from Minnesota said it had to be. But long before that, it was the pot that sat on every back burner in New England, every Monday, every winter, year after year, like something better than a clock. Number 4. Rice and gravy. Leftover pan drippings from whatever meat had been cooked the night before. Flour stirred in. Water or broth from something else. The gravy cooked until it thickened and turned the color of dark tea. Poured over a bowl of plain white rice. In the farming parishes of Louisiana and the coastal counties of South Carolina, rice and gravy was not a side dish. It was the meal. Rice fields had defined the economy of the Carolina Lowcountry for 200 years, and even after those fields changed, the habit of rice never left. A pound of long-grain white rice cost 20 cents in 1953. The gravy cost nothing because it was made from drippings that would have gone into the trash. A woman in Beaufort County, South Carolina, who raised 9 children on her husband's shrimping wages, said her family ate rice and gravy 3 times a week without complaint. You ate what was made. Back then, that was the understanding, and it held. Number 3. Salt pork and greens. A piece of salt pork cured until it kept without refrigeration. Put in a pot with water and simmered until the fat began to render. Then the greens dropped in. Collards, turnip tops, mustard greens. Poke salad in spring when it was the only green thing growing. The greens cooked down to almost nothing, absorbing every bit of pork flavor in the water. The liquid left at the bottom was called pot liquor, and you poured it over cornbread and ate it as carefully as the greens themselves. A pound of salt pork cost 19 cents in 1952. The greens were free, picked from the yard or the hillside. The women who cooked this meal didn't call themselves cooks. They called themselves mothers. They didn't measure. They didn't time the greens. They knew by the smell when the pot liquor was ready and by the feel of the leaves whether they had cooked long enough. That knowledge didn't come from a cookbook. It came from standing at the elbow of a mother who learned it from her mother, passed down through generations of women who cooked over wood fires with no running water and fed families of 12 without serving the same supper twice. This was the meal that kept mining families alive in the coal fields of southern Virginia and the deep hollows of western North Carolina. There was no recipe because no recipe was needed. There was salt pork, there were greens, there was cornbread, and there was the patience of women who knew the longer the pot simmered, the better the table would be. They couldn't rush it, so they learned not to. That patience is gone from most kitchens now. The meal is still better than you remember. Number 2. Scrambled eggs and toast. 3 eggs, cracked into a cold skillet, stirred slowly over low heat until they came together in soft, barely set folds. 2 slices of bread, toasted and buttered. Salt. That is breakfast. That is also supper. In working families across every state in this country, eggs weren't breakfast food or dinner food. They were the food you made when everything else had run out and you needed to feed someone fast. A dozen eggs cost 60 cents in 1950. That is 12 suppers for 5 cents apiece. The women who made scrambled eggs for supper didn't apologize for it. They set the plate down and went back to whatever else needed doing. Your grandmother didn't call it a poor meal. She called it eggs and toast, and that was the whole conversation. The children ate. Nobody questioned it. That was the way it worked in those houses back then, and it was a better way than we've given it credit for. Number 1. Fried apple rings. Apples cored and sliced into thick rings. Butter in the skillet. The rings laid flat and fried slowly over low heat. Turned once until the apple softened and the edges caramelized and the kitchen filled with something that smelled like a bakery and cost nothing. Sprinkled with a little sugar or drizzled with sorghum. Served alongside pork chops when there were any, or alone when there weren't. In the apple-growing hollows of western North Carolina and the orchard counties of the Virginia Shenandoah Valley, apples were free in the fall. Every farm had trees. Every family put up barrels in the root cellar. Fried apples were not just dessert. They were a side dish, a sweetener, a way to stretch a thin supper into something that felt complete and beautiful. A woman named Vera Mae Hollifield, who farmed 40 acres outside Hendersonville, North Carolina in the early 1950s, fried apples every October from her own trees. She paid nothing for it. She served it to her family every evening for 6 weeks straight, and they asked for it again every year until she was gone. Free, simple, beautiful. That was the whole recipe. Bacon grease jar cooking was more than a habit. It was a household tradition passed down through generations. After cooking bacon, no one ever threw out the grease. It was poured into a tin can, jar, or ceramic container and kept right on the stove or in the fridge, ready to use in just about everything. This rendered fat added smoky, savory depth to greens, eggs, cornbread, gravies, and even biscuits. For families on a budget, it was a goldmine of flavor that cost nothing extra. Some cooks would use it to start soups and stews, others to fry potatoes or season beans. A little bacon fat could turn the most humble vegetable into a side dish worth remembering. Cookbooks from the 1940s and 50s often listed bacon drippings as a key ingredient, not just a substitution. And when butter or lard was hard to find during wartime rationing, bacon grease picked up the slack with ease. It was efficient, it was tasty, and it felt like a little act of defiance, taking a scrap and making something wonderful with it. Even today, some home kitchens still keep a jar on the back burner because good flavor never goes out of style. Radish sandwiches were a humble immigrant contribution that grew popular in working-class neighborhoods across America. Garden radishes were cheap, easy to grow, and added a sharp, peppery bite to otherwise plain bread. Families often spread butter or sprinkled salt across the slices before layering the radishes inside. This created a sandwich that was crisp, refreshing, and filling without requiring meat. In German and Eastern European households, it was common to see baskets of radishes brought in straight from backyard gardens and immediately turned into sandwiches for quick lunches. The simplicity of the dish was part of its charm, and it reminded families of traditions from back home. For children, it might not have been the most exciting lunch, but it offered nutrition at almost no cost. For adults, it represented both thrift and cultural memory, showing how old world recipes adapted to new American lives. The taste of radishes and butter on bread still brings memories of family tables where nothing went to waste and every harvest was used to its fullest. Hamburger cornbread bake showed up in the 1940s as a direct result of wartime arithmetic. Beef was rationed, cornmeal was not. Ground beef browned with onion and seasoned simply, salt, pepper, a can of creamed corn stirred in for moisture, spread into a cast iron skillet, then covered with a poured cornbread batter slightly looser than usual, thin enough to flow around the edges and seal the meat underneath. In the oven, the batter puffed and browned into a crust that absorbed the fat and juices rising from below, so the bottom of the cornbread was savory in a way the top never was. You served it by scooping rather than slicing, the crust breaking apart over the filling, the steam catching you before you got the first bite to your mouth. The technique became standard in Southern and Appalachian kitchens through the 50s and 60s, passed along without a recipe card because the women who made it baked cornbread often enough that they could pour the batter without measuring. The ones who could do that aren't here to teach it now. Eggless mayonnaise substitute was a lifesaver when rationing hit hard and eggs disappeared from pantry shelves. Homemakers got creative, crafting sandwich spreads and dressings without a single yolk. The secret was evaporated milk, mixed with vinegar or lemon juice, mustard, and a touch of oil. The acid thickened the milk into something creamy and tangy, surprisingly close to the real deal. This makeshift mayo showed up in potato salads, slaws, sandwiches, and deviled egg imposters alike. Wartime cookbooks often included multiple versions, each with different ratios or seasonings, depending on what was available. Some added sugar or paprika, while others leaned savory with onion powder and garlic. It wasn't about perfect replication. It was about good enough flavor when options were scarce. This DIY condiment not only stretched your supplies, but also kept familiar dishes on the table, boosting morale when meals were otherwise bare bones. And for families trying to create something resembling a normal lunch, that made all the difference. It's one of those small, clever tricks that helped people hold on to their routines and their dignity when the world around them was anything but predictable. Carrot and raisin sandwiches might sound unusual now, but they were a thrifty way to use up two very common ingredients in mid-century kitchens. Housewives shredded carrots, stirred them with mayonnaise, sprinkled in raisins, and spread the mixture on soft bread. The result was sweet, tangy, and slightly crunchy, making it a filling and inexpensive lunch option. Carrots were cheap and widely grown in victory gardens, while raisins were pantry staples that lasted for months. The sandwich was often given to children because it felt almost like a treat while still being nutritious. Raisins added natural sweetness, making the vegetables easier to enjoy. Some families used this mixture not just on sandwiches but also in salads, but pressed between bread it became portable and practical. It carried a sense of frugal creativity, turning humble pantry items into something memorable. Many children who grew up in the 1940s and 1950s recall this sandwich as a symbol of how their parents made the best of limited supplies. The mix of bright carrots and chewy raisins in mayonnaise was strange but unforgettable. Grape jelly meatballs were the 1960s best-kept potluck secret, and the rule was simple. You never told anyone what was in the sauce until after they'd had seconds. Equal parts grape jelly and chili sauce into the pot. The meatballs simmered in that sweet, sour purple glaze until they turned glossy and tender, and the whole thing went into a crock pot you could carry across town. Every woman who made them swore the recipe was too embarrassing to share. Every woman who tasted them begged for it. The chemistry was real. The jelly's pectin thickened the sauce, the fruit's acidity cut through the fat, and the result tasted like nothing you could name but couldn't stop eating. Church socials, baby showers, and neighborhood suppers from the late 1950s through the 80s all had a crock pot of these somewhere on the table. When someone finally asked what was in the sauce and you told them, you watched the same expression cross every face: disbelief, reconsideration, and the slow reach back for another one. That expression was the whole point. Stale bread pudding was the kind of dessert that felt like a miracle. You started with scraps, slices of old, hard bread that no one wanted to eat, and somehow turned them into something soft, sweet, and deeply satisfying. The recipe was simple. Soak the bread in milk, add a little sugar and cinnamon, crack in an egg or two, and bake until golden and custardy. The result was a warm, gooey pudding that felt far richer than the ingredients would suggest. For families with tight grocery budgets, this was a way to avoid waste and still have something sweet at the end of the day. In some variations, raisins or chopped apples were added when available. Others poured syrup or canned fruit over the top for a little flair. No matter how it was made, it was always a dish rooted in resourcefulness. Cookbooks from the 1940s practically sang its praises, and community recipe swaps often featured a dozen different versions. It wasn't just a dessert, it was a lesson in creativity, frugality, and the magic of making do. And if you ask anyone who grew up eating it, they'll probably say it still tastes like love. Apple and cheese sandwiches combined sweet fruit with salty cheddar, a pairing that might sound modern but has roots deep in mid-century lunch tables. Children often carried these sandwiches to school because apples were cheap, plentiful, and lasted longer than many other fruits. Thinly sliced apples layered with cheddar created a crisp and tangy bite that contrasted with soft white bread. The result was a sandwich that filled stomachs and delivered both protein and energy for the rest of the day. Families loved it because it could be made quickly with just a few slices of fruit and a small piece of cheese. It was simple, portable, and easy to prepare ahead of time. In rural areas where apples were grown in abundance, this became a particularly common lunch. The sandwich carried both the freshness of the orchard and the practicality of stretching cheese to cover multiple meals. Today, the combination might be seen as gourmet, but back then it was ordinary thrift. The apple and cheese sandwich remains a reminder of how resourceful families once were with what little they had. Reused pickle juice marinade might sound odd today, but back then it was a beloved trick that saved both money and flavor. When a jar of pickles was finished, the brine left behind was never poured down the drain. Instead, frugal home cooks would use it to marinate meats, soak onions, dress potato salads, or even brighten up beans. The vinegar and spices acted like an instant flavor booster, turning bland ingredients into something tangy, zippy, and unexpectedly delicious. Pickle brine also tenderized cheaper cuts of meat, making it a go-to solution for tougher steaks or leftover roast. In fact, the practice was so widespread that old cookbooks listed pickle juice right alongside salt and pepper in many recipes. Some even recommended saving different types of brine, dill, sweet, or hot, and matching them to particular dishes. It was all part of the waste-nothing attitude of the time. Even if your pantry was nearly empty, you could make dinner feel interesting again with nothing more than a splash of what was left in the pickle jar. It's proof that creativity doesn't need fancy ingredients, just a good memory, a bit of vinegar, and a whole lot of heart. Peanut butter and pickle sandwiches surprised many who tried them, but they quickly became a thrifty favorite in kitchens across America. Dill or bread and butter pickles sliced thin were layered over peanut butter spread on soft white bread. The tangy crunch of pickles cut through the heavy sweetness of peanut butter, creating a sandwich that was filling and balanced. It was cheap to make, since jars of pickles lasted for weeks, and peanut butter was already a pantry essential. Children often found it odd at first bite, but many grew to love the bold mix of flavors. Adults appreciated how quickly it could be prepared before work or packed into lunches. It was another Depression-era invention that stayed popular through wartime rationing. Some even claimed it kept hunger away longer than simpler sandwiches, thanks to the mix of salt and fat. What began as a practical way to stretch food supplies turned into a surprisingly enduring classic. The peanut butter and pickle sandwich is still remembered fondly as a strange yet beloved part of American lunch history. Calico beans got their name from the coat of a calico cat, the way 3 or 4 kinds of beans and browned meat created a patchwork of colors in the baking dish that looked, if you squinted, like something that was actually pretty. Ground beef browned with bacon and onions, then combined with canned pork and beans, kidney beans, and butter beans in a sauce of ketchup, brown sugar, cider vinegar, and mustard, baked until it bubbled and thickened at the edges. By the 1960s, this dish was a fixture at church potlucks, summer cookouts, and county fair covered dish suppers from Wisconsin to Kansas. It stretched a half-pound of beef into something that fed 20 people and held heat for hours. Ideal for the long drive to the fairgrounds. You brought it in a cast-iron Dutch oven if you had one, a covered casserole if you didn't, and the pot came back empty every single time. These days, calico beans have slipped off the menu almost everywhere that isn't a Midwestern church basement, replaced by dishes that take more effort and feed fewer people with less warmth. If calico beans were the centerpiece of the Midwestern potluck table, mock apple pie with Ritz crackers is the kind of recipe that sounds like a joke until you try it. This Depression-era dessert was born when apples were either too expensive or too hard to come by, but families still wanted something sweet to finish off the day. Enter the Ritz cracker, a salty, buttery, flaky little miracle that, when soaked in sugar syrup and lemon juice, somehow started to taste like baked apples. Cookbooks from the 1930s described the recipe as appleless apple pie, and you could find it in community recipe cards all the way through the 1970s. The crackers were layered inside a crust and spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg. The filling baked down into a warm, sticky, and surprisingly convincing substitute for the real thing. If someone didn't tell you, you probably would never know. What made this dish so genius was how it turned an ordinary pantry staple into a dessert that felt luxurious in a time when luxuries were few and far between. People would gather around the table, pass around the pie, and pretend it was made with fresh-picked fruit from a local orchard, and honestly, most didn't mind the difference one bit. Fried bologna sandwiches became a blue-collar classic across mid-century America, especially in industrial towns. Bologna was cheap, widely available, and could be sliced thick or thin depending on the household budget. When fried in a skillet, the edges curled and crisped, giving it more flavor than when served cold. Families placed those sizzling slices between bread, often with mustard or onions, turning a humble ingredient into something hearty. Factory workers carried them in lunch pails, and children looked forward to them as a treat because frying made the meat feel special. This sandwich was a perfect example of stretching modest foods into meals that felt bigger. Bologna was considered a working man's staple, and frying it added both texture and aroma that livened up the day. The smell alone could fill a kitchen and make it feel like more was being served than what truly was. In the era when affordability mattered most, fried bologna sandwiches proved that even simple meat could feel indulgent with just a hot pan. The miners who ate slumgullion in the California gold rush camps of the 1850s probably didn't enjoy it much. The name, from words meaning slime and cesspool, wasn't meant to flatter. But the idea behind it, a flexible stew of whatever meat, vegetables, and starches were on hand, simmered together until they became more than their parts, traveled through every lean decade, and arrived in Depression-era kitchens as a genuine weeknight staple. Ground beef browned with onion, mixed with canned corn and tomatoes and crackers or pasta, simmered until the crackers dissolved into the broth and thickened it from the inside. Every family had a different name for it. Some called it goulash, some slumgullion, some just called it supper. One woman who learned it in the middle 1930s remembered it being made with bacon and very little hamburger. Better the next day after the flavors blended. You didn't measure it, you didn't follow steps. The ability to walk up to an open refrigerator and see a meal was what it taught. It faded when pantries got fuller and the urgency went with them. Creamed, canned corn with a flour slurry was one of those dishes that made something ordinary feel just a little indulgent. The idea was to take a can of corn, cheap, shelf-stable, and always on hand, and give it a makeover. You'd pour the corn, liquid and all, into a saucepan and stir in a quick mix of water and flour. As it simmered, the slurry thickened the liquid into a creamy, starchy sauce that hugged every kernel. Some recipes suggested a splash of milk or a dab of margarine if you had it. But even without those, the final result was comforting. It mimicked the texture of creamed corn without needing fresh cream or butter, two things that were either rationed or too expensive for many homes. This little side dish showed up at dinner tables next to meatloaf, fried potatoes, or bean patties, giving the meal a creamy contrast and helping to fill plates without much cost. It's a great example of how far a single can and a spoonful of flour could go. Cookbooks promoted this trick for its thrift, but people remembered it because it worked. Simple, smart, and warm. What more could you ask for? Potato salad sandwiches were exactly what they sound like. Scoops of leftover potato salad spread generously between two slices of bread. For factory workers, this was an easy and inexpensive way to carry a hearty lunch without needing meat. The salad itself was already built from simple ingredients: boiled potatoes, mayonnaise, mustard, and chopped vegetables, so stretching it into sandwiches was just one step further. The bread turned a bowl of cold salad into something portable and easy to hold in greasy hands. These sandwiches were commonly packed into lunch pails wrapped in wax paper, and they traveled well. Children in households that made large batches of potato salad could expect to see this on the table when times were tight. It was a thrifty way to make sure nothing went to waste and every bit of food pulled double duty. The Depression years had everyone inventing new uses for leftovers, and this was one of the simplest yet cleverest examples. Even long after rationing ended, many workers still remembered carrying potato salad sandwiches as part of their daily grind. Johnny Marzetti arrived in American kitchens through the back door of a Columbus, Ohio restaurant in the 1920s. And by the time anyone outside Ohio thought to ask about it, half the Midwest had been eating it for years. Italian immigrant Teresa Marzetti opened her restaurant in 1896 near Ohio State University and developed a baked casserole of ground beef, tomato sauce, noodles, and cheddar that sold for 45 cents a plate. The Columbus Public Schools put it on their menus, then spread it statewide. A proper Marzetti was baked, not stovetop. In the oven, the flavors married, the cheese browned at the edges, and the noodles along the bottom got that appealing crustiness everyone wanted but wouldn't say so. You learned to take your serving from the edge of the dish if you got there first. Teresa's recipe appeared in the Columbus Dispatch as early as 1916, spread through church cookbooks and community potlucks until the whole Rust Belt knew her name, and now most people under 50 have never heard of it. The restaurant closed in 1972. Potato peel broth was one of those quiet genius ideas that made the most out of the bare minimum. You had potato skins piling up on the counter, and instead of tossing them out, cooks would throw them into a pot of water, maybe with an onion skin or two, and simmer it down into a golden, earthy broth. It may not sound like much today, but back then it was practically liquid gold. Rich in nutrients and surprisingly flavorful, it served as the base for soups, stews, or even gravy. Old cookbooks were filled with reminders to never waste a peel, and this was the perfect example of why. In times when every cent and calorie counted, this broth delivered on both. You could salt it lightly, strain it, and store it for later, and no one would bat an eye if it was used more than once for multiple meals. The broth could also be thickened with flour or mashed potatoes to create something heartier, especially when meat wasn't on the menu. When families had more mouths than money, this was one of the smartest ways to stretch a sack of potatoes into several meals. A humble peel became a warm, nourishing bowl of comfort. Banana and mayonnaise sandwich may sound like a prank today, but in mid-20th century Southern kitchens, it was a beloved lunch. The combination of soft banana slices with creamy mayonnaise spread across white bread gave a taste that was both sweet and tangy. Housewives found it easy to make because bananas were cheap and mayonnaise came in jars that stretched across multiple meals. It was often handed to children as an after-school snack, sometimes with a dusting of sugar to sweeten the flavor further. The sandwich had strong ties to Southern frugality, where every food item had to work double duty. Bananas ripened fast, so when they were spotted brown, they were sliced up before they spoiled. Mayonnaise added moisture and body to what otherwise could have been just plain fruit on bread. It was filling without being heavy, and it delivered energy for the rest of the day. This was one of those foods that stuck around because of practicality, not fashion. Even today, some families still swear by it as an old comfort that never lost its charm. Long before the biscuit ring filled pans in the Midwest, Volga German immigrants were already folding ground beef into dough along the Nebraska and Kansas prairie, calling it bierach or runza, depending on which family you asked. The filling was beef and cabbage, chopped cabbage wilted into browned beef, seasoned with caraway if the cook was traditional, salt and pepper if she wasn't, sealed inside soft yeasted dough and baked until the outside turned golden and the filling steamed itself into tenderness inside. These settlers brought the recipe to Nebraska and Kansas in the early 20th century and spread it the way all important recipes moved, through hands, not paper. A Nebraska woman who grew up eating them through the 1940s could tell, just from the weight of one in her hand, whether the dough-to-filling ratio was right. When the Runza restaurant chain opened in Lincoln in 1949, it gave the sandwich a consistent commercial shape, but the home version, heavier, a little uneven, was something the restaurant could approximate but never quite match. That version left with the women who made it. One-crust vegetable pie was a budget-saving marvel hiding in plain sight. In the pages of countless Depression-era and wartime cookbooks, you'd find this clever suggestion: skip the top crust. Why? Because flour, lard, and butter were rationed, and a double crust was considered an unnecessary luxury. Instead, home cooks would pour a simple vegetable filling, often made from onions, carrots, potatoes, or cabbage, into a single pie shell and bake it until golden. These pies weren't flashy, but they were hearty, reliable, and warm. The single crust cut costs in half while still delivering the texture and comfort people craved. Occasionally, if a family had a little meat on hand, they'd chop it finely and mix it into the filling to boost the flavor and stretch it further. Cheese, if available, might go on top. But most often, it was just vegetables, a thickened sauce, and that humble base of baked dough. It was more than enough. The one-crust pie reflected the kind of frugality that didn't feel like deprivation. It felt like smart, resourceful living. For people managing rations and rising prices, it offered something surprisingly rich, the feeling that dinner was still something to look forward to. Peanut butter and lettuce sandwich was one of those meals that lived in school lunchboxes during the Depression when every penny mattered. Families needed something that was cheap, quick to assemble, and still felt like it carried some crunch and variety. Iceberg lettuce was the secret weapon here. It was inexpensive, available in nearly every grocery store, and could transform a plain peanut butter sandwich into something that felt fresh and different. Kids would bite through soft bread, then hit the creamy peanut butter, and finally get the crisp snap of lettuce. It was a strange combination to some, but to families who relied on it, it became a familiar comfort. Teachers even remembered whole rows of children unwrapping wax paper parcels to reveal the same pairing inside. The Depression was filled with meals that seem unusual to us now, but were lifelines to people then. This sandwich was not about luxury, but about making children feel full enough to get through a long day. That mix of protein, fat, and crunch turned it into a memory that would never really leave those who grew up with it. Stretcher patties were the Depression's most honest recipe, a name that didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. When meat rationing during World War II limited each adult to 2.5 pounds of beef per week, home cooks developed a technique for making 1 pound behave like 2. Mix it with rolled oats, crushed crackers, or grated potato, then season aggressively enough that the filler disappeared into the flavor. Pressed thin and fried in cast iron until the outside crisped and the inside stayed tender, they didn't taste like compromise. They tasted better than a plain burger in ways that took years to understand. Gladys Klein of Burlington, Wisconsin, remembered making them through the war years. The oats absorbed the beef juices as they cooked, trapping a depth of flavor the all-beef version couldn't match. When rationing ended and thick patties became affordable again, stretcher patties vanished almost overnight. A generation of cooks took their knowledge of what oats could do for ground beef, and when they left the kitchen, the knowledge went too. Meatless gravy with drippings was one of those flavor-saving secrets every thrifty cook swore by. When meat was scarce, but flavor was still essential, the pan drippings left behind after cooking even a small piece of meat became pure treasure. A few tablespoons of fat, a sprinkle of flour, and a bit of water or broth was all it took to whip up a rich, velvety sauce. This gravy didn't need chunks of meat. It carried the essence of it, thanks to the browned bits and rendered fat that clung to the bottom of every skillet. In many households, meatless gravy showed up more often than actual meat, poured over potatoes, toast, rice, or biscuits to give a little something extra to otherwise plain staples. Some added herbs or a splash of vinegar for zing. Others stirred in canned mushrooms or onions to mimic texture and body. It was a dish built entirely out of scraps and instinct, and it brought comfort when comfort was in short supply. If someone managed to get a hold of real broth, they'd stretch it with drippings to double the yield. It wasn't fancy, but it was satisfying, and that made all the difference. Egg and olive sandwiches gave families another way to stretch a few hard-boiled eggs into several filling meals. Chopping the eggs with mayonnaise and folding in green olives added tang and texture, giving the spread more bite than plain egg salad. For children, it was often tucked into school lunches, while adults enjoyed it as a quick midday meal. The olives gave the mixture a salty, briny punch that balanced the richness of egg yolks. Since eggs were relatively cheap and easy to come by, this sandwich became a Depression-era and post-war favorite. Some recipes also included a bit of celery or onion for extra crunch, but the heart of it was always the chopped olives. Housewives liked it because it was simple and fast to prepare, yet it looked colorful and inviting on a plate. Served on soft white bread, it felt like a small luxury despite its frugality. The mix of protein and flavor kept it popular in many homes well beyond its humble beginnings. For those who ate it often, the memory of tangy egg and olive filling never really faded. The loose meat sandwich was what Iowa built its food identity around, and if you called it a sloppy Joe within earshot of someone from Sioux City, you would hear about it. The story starts in 1924, when Dave Heglin began selling seasoned, loose ground beef at Ye Old Tavern in Sioux City. No patty, no sauce, scooped onto a steamed bun with mustard, pickles, and onion. 2 years later, butcher Fred Angel opened the first Made-Right in Muscatine, steaming his beef in a proprietary dark liquid and letting the crumbly, juicy result spread through Iowa with the persistence of something that knows exactly what it is. You ate it leaning over the counter because it fell apart the moment you picked it up. And that was not a flaw. That was the point. 2 distinct tastes in every bite, the old-timers said, and neither translated to any other preparation. The woman who drove 40 minutes out of her way to stop at the Marshalltown Made-Right on every road trip took that habit with her, and the children she raised elsewhere grew up without it. Here is the challenge. This week, make one of these: the fried potatoes and onions, the beans and cornbread, the bread and milk before bed. Sit down at the table, not the couch. Set a place. Eat it slowly. Because these meals weren't just about being poor. They were about a generation of women who got up every morning with an empty pantry and found a way to fill it by nightfall, who stood at a cast-iron skillet in a kitchen with no dishwasher, no microwave, and sometimes no hot running water, and made something that tasted like everything would be all right. Tell me in the comments which one your family made. I want to know if fried bologna beats fried potatoes in your memory. I want to know if anyone else's grandmother served scrambled eggs for supper and set the plate down like it was a roast. I want to know if beans and cornbread still shows up at your table, or if it got left behind in the decades between your grandma's kitchen and yours. Because these are not just recipes. They are proof that the simplest food, made from almost nothing by women who had everything to lose, can still be the most beautiful meal you ever ate. Now, I am not a doctor or a dietitian. This is not medical advice. But those women knew something about feeding a family that no cookbook has ever fully explained.